Could you tell any of those apart? The best camera you can use is the one that you actually have on you. And for most people, that's their phone. And the most popular phone in the world is the iPhone. So it only makes sense to want to compare last year's flagship, the iPhone 13 Pro, versus this year's flagship, the iPhone 14 Pro. So that's what we're going to do. Now, the main differences between the camera systems on the two phones are low light improvement in the 14 Pro, the new 24mm focal length, 4K cinematic mode, action mode, and of course, the biggest one, the new 48 megapixel sensor, up from the 12 megapixels that the iPhone has been at since 2015 with the iPhone 6s. Now, this sounds like a massive increase, but is it actually noticeable? Now, I'll put up some examples side by side on the screen, but I'll give it a few seconds before I actually say which one is which, so you can see how many you get right, if you can even notice a difference. All right, so we're going to start with the main lens. That's the 24mm on the 14 Pro and the 26mm on the 13 Pro. Looking at these two side by side, it's tough to tell them apart just by looking at them quickly, even if you spend a couple seconds on it. What I notice, you can tell that the 13 Pro, definitely more saturated colors. The 14 Pro, you can definitely see more detail. If you look at the Jordan Wings logo, you'll see it's sharper, it's crisper on the 14 Pro. This is thanks to the photonic engine. You're able to see a lot more of those fine details, and we're going to see this more and more throughout all these pictures. That photonic engine really does a great job of bringing out the fine details. But otherwise, these two pictures are close. Besides seeing that it's a little bit wider in the 14 Pro and that Jordan logo a little bit sharper, wouldn't be able to tell these apart. I like the colors better on the 14 Pro over here. And then again, if we zoom in a little bit, you can see so much more detail on the 14 Pro. Look at the basketball. Look at the dust on his head. That's where you notice the differences. It's the small, fine-tuned details. But so far, we haven't noticed those differences unless we really, really punched in. This is about 250%. Now over here, it's a little tougher to tell the difference between these two. I think the 13 Pro did a really good job here. The 14 Pro, you could see, again, same theme. More detail. As you punch in, you're seeing more detail. And these are all with the 12 megapixel resolution so far. We haven't even touched the 48 yet. Here's some really terrible lighting scenarios. Really, really, really low light. This is just in a garage. Honestly, I think the 13 Pro, I was expecting a bigger difference. I thought the 14 Pro was going to look like a massive difference because of the better low light performance, but the 13 Pro really did a good job. And honestly, I kind of like the color better on the 13 Pro this time. The white, I think, just looks better in these shots on the 13 Pro. But brightness-wise, I don't see a big difference. Definitely not the 2 or 3 times difference that it's supposed to be. Now for the ultra-wide lens, they're both pretty similar. This is a good example of an HDR scene where we have the ground, which is in shadow, the sky, which is very, very bright, obviously, and then I'm shooting pretty much directly into the sun. So we have a lot of different light sources going on over here. The 14 Pro did a really good job. Look at how much better the ground looks in the 14 Pro. You can actually see that that's a brighter shot. It did a better job with the HDR, and it did a better job handling the dynamic range here. Here's another one with the ultra-wide lens in that terrible lighting scenario. Again, I think the 13 Pro, it honestly might look better here. All right, onto the 3 times or telephoto lens. On here, I'm liking the colors better on the 14 Pro again. You can see a lot more detail in the hair. Look at the shirt. You can see a lot more of those fine details in the shirt. But don't get me wrong, the 13 Pro, that's still a really good picture. You know, unless you had these two side by side, you wouldn't look at the picture on the left and think, that doesn't look great. That could be better. That 13 Pro still did a really good job. This one here of the stairs and the grass, it's really just the color. That's really pretty much the only thing that I notice as a difference. The 14 Pro, those colors look a lot more natural. I wanted to give this one a challenge, so I wanted to take a picture of something where you can see a whole bunch of leaves in there. The 13 Pro, it just looks kind of mushy. If you're looking at the detail of those leaves, once you get up close and once you're looking closely at it and then look at the detail on the ground, the 14 Pro does a much better job here. Those fine details, that photonic engine coming back, I think the 14 Pro does a much better job with details on here. The 13 Pro picture, if you're just looking at it, it looks fine. But if you're actually looking at it, it looks like a smartphone, where the 14 Pro doesn't. All right, and I did a couple where we actually zoom in. This is using the 2x zoom, which came back on the 14 Pro as something you can actually click, or on the 13 Pro you have to use the wheel. That's because the 14 Pro, it'll just crop in on that 48 megapixel sensor to basically act as a fourth lens. The 13 Pro, it has to digitally zoom in, which is why it looks so bad on the 13 Pro. This is one of the biggest ones where you can easily see the difference there. And this one, we went all the way into as far as the phone could zoom in, so 15 times zoom. Now for the macro photography, I honestly didn't do as good of a job testing it as I should have. These two pictures, I didn't realize how not close they were until I got to the computer and was looking at them. But from what I can notice on here, the color on the 13 Pro, I think does look better, especially on that silver portion of the car. But the detail in the raindrops that you can see on the 14 Pro, I think looks significantly better. Now the front-facing camera, I never even noticed, I hardly used the front-facing camera, but I never even noticed before that it didn't have autofocus, and now it does. That's pretty much the biggest change with it this year. Both of these, I mean, that's not a great picture, but both of these pictures, I think, look almost the same. You can see a little bit of different detail in the shirt, but I don't see a huge difference with this one. However, this picture, this one I see a big difference. The 14 Pro just looks so much better than the 13 Pro does. Look at the details on the skin. Look at the color of the shirt. I think the 14 Pro crushed it on this one. All right, portrait mode. Both of these were done with the telephoto lens. The 14 Pro did a much better job of keeping the foreground brightly lit. And this is just an example of that dynamic range again. The 13 Pro picture is more or less what it looked like in real life, where you can see the shadows and it looks darker. The 14 Pro almost brightened it up for you to make everything look better. Back to the shoes. Again, this was pretty much the perfect lighting scenario, so these pictures are going to be tough to tell the difference on them. If you look close enough, the 14 Pro, the foreground is blurred out as well as the background. And that's the biggest difference in portrait mode this year for it, is that it'll blur the foreground and the background. And that way just whatever the subject is in the middle stays in focus. The background also, it does look a little bit more blurred, even though I didn't change any of the settings on either of them. The background on the 14 Pro does look, unless it's just me, I think it looks more blurred. All right, now onto the 48 megapixel comparison. We're comparing 48 megapixels on the 14 Pro Max versus the 12 megapixels on the 13 Pro Max. Both of these are shot in RAW, but can you tell the difference? Right now, honestly, if I didn't have the labels on them, I wouldn't be able to tell. Maybe the sky would give it away, where the sky in the 14 Pro, it has a little bit more detail, but if I'm looking at the subject, the car, I'm not seeing much of a difference. Zooming in, that's where you can see a little bit more of the detail. So the biggest benefit of a 48 megapixel is you have so much more room to zoom in and still have everything look sharp. Or if you're blowing it up on a big poster or something, so for those of you that like to print out your pictures, hang them up, you might notice a huge difference with the 48 megapixel, something that you won't see just looking at them on a computer. In good outdoor light, both of these phones really do an amazing job. And in most cases, you're not going to be able to tell the difference. Even when they're side by side, in most cases, it's not easy to tell the difference between the two. Most cases, I like the colors on the 14 Pro better. Every now and again, there's something that I see that I think is the 14 Pro and it actually is the 13 Pro. But most of the time, I like the color on the 14 Pro better. But honestly, even at 48 versus 12 megapixels, the number sounds like it's a huge difference and you should see a crazy difference in the pictures. Do you? All right, now let's finish it up with video. Cinematic mode. Now this year, the 14 Pro gets cinematic mode in 4K. The 13 Pro had to use 1080p. So you should see more detail with the 14 Pro. It also gives you more room to zoom in later if you need to. Action mode, this is probably the easiest thing to tell the difference between the two phones. Both of these were done at exactly the same time. The 13 Pro right next to the 14 Pro. Now the downside to action mode is it crops in a little bit, 2.8K instead of 4K. But for results like this, I don't think that's a big deal. I think that's something I could live with. Now, I don't think any of those were really super easy to tell which was the 14 and which was the 13 Pro. That just goes to show you how good of a camera the 13 Pro really was and still is. Now, don't get me wrong. The 14 Pro definitely is a phenomenal camera. Pictures look great. And when you look closely enough, you can definitely see a difference. But that's the thing. You have to look pretty close to see the difference between them. And most people scrolling through on their phone, looking at a picture real quick, not going to be able to tell. Even some of these side by side had a hard time telling which one was which. Now, I said something very similar in my iPhone 14 Pro review, so if you haven't seen that, definitely check that out. But basically, if you're coming from a 13 to a 14, it's not a huge jump camera-wise. If you're coming from something older, definitely you'll see a massive improvement. But direct comparison, last year's 13 Pro versus this year's 14 Pro, the 13 Pro killed it. The 14 Pro does great, but the 13 Pro is really, really good too.